Canada. It's one of the best places in the world to live. For decades, immigrants have flocked to this large, spacious country to build a better life for themselves, on the belief that Canada is a wealthy, welcoming, stable, and compassionate place. But what if almost none of that were true anymore? What if while no one was looking, Canada lost its ability to generate wealth, turned its back on the people in need, and is now losing its social stability? Sadly, all of that increasingly appears to be the case. For generations, Canadians prided themselves on the fact that even though they were a little less wealthy than their American cousins, they at least lived in a more compassionate society. One where there was no homelessness, where the worst off in society were taken care of, and where everyone could count on a social safety net if something went wrong. Well, no more. After decades of commodifying its housing market and decades of failed policies from its politicians, Canada is seeing exploding levels of homelessness. And despite the government's best efforts to sweep the problem under the rug, there's no more denying it. Tent cities are popping up all over the country, in cities large and small, and even in small towns.
I didn't think I'd be working a job and living in a van, especially in the winter. My biggest issue is parking, because I don't live at a campground. That would cost more than rent. So I basically live on the streets of Halifax. I try and find free parking places close to work. And then on my days off, I'm looking for parking, in a park or close to the ocean or somewhere nice, at least out of the city.
In the suburbs of Vancouver, the parking lots near commuter highways are filling up with people living in their cars. In Toronto, the once beautiful Allen Gardens, a botanical garden in the city center, has now become a tent city. The small city of London, Ontario, hasn't dealt with a homelessness problem since the Great Depression, but today the park that runs along its riverbanks has become a sprawling tent city. Researchers at the local St. Joseph's Healthcare Network decided to look into the problem, not just in London, but across the entire country. And they concluded that Canada has 3 times as many homeless people as had been previously estimated. While Statistics Canada estimates that the country has 235,000 homeless people, the researchers estimated that the real number is closer to 750,000. That's equivalent to the population of the cities of Seattle or Denver. And for a country of 40 million people, slightly more than California, that's a huge number of homeless people. California is the epicenter of homelessness in the United States, and it's estimated to have around 172,000 people experiencing homelessness. Proportionately, Canada has 4 times as many homeless people as California. Canada's booming homeless population puts an enormous strain on the already struggling Canadian economy. It is estimated that homelessness costs the Canadian economy over $7 billion annually. This comes at a huge opportunity cost to the rest of the economy. If Canada has to spend $7 billion to support its homeless population, that means there's $7 billion less to spend on improving the lives of other Canadians, such as increasing productivity or by creating affordable housing. The staggering amount of money needed for homelessness accounts for community support, emergency shelters, as well as increased costs to the criminal justice system, healthcare, and emergency services. This is because homeless individuals are disproportionately accessing the judicial and medical system compared to the rest of the Canadian population. Oftentimes, homeless individuals are more susceptible to health conditions that require treatment and are 70% more likely to visit the doctor's office. Moreover, many homeless people are unable to work or hold a steady job, meaning that as individuals, many homeless people do not contribute to the Canadian economy. If a person has no income, they can't be taxed and aren't able to contribute to the overall economy. So how did Canada get into this mess? The answer is two-pronged: failing government policies and a housing market that is run out of control. To understand how Canada got here, we have to rewind the clock to the 1990s. Back then, Canada's federal government was dealing with a massive budget deficit. It was so huge that in 1994, the Wall Street Journal declared that Canada had become an honorary member of the Third World. To fix the problem, the government at the time, a liberal government led by Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, instituted massive spending cuts. Spending on social programs and healthcare was drastically reduced. The federal government also offloaded responsibility for many programs to Canada's 10 provincial and 3 territorial governments. But Canada had recently undergone a brutal recession, and those provincial governments had deficit problems of their own. They didn't have the money to take over the expenses that the federal government offloaded onto them. So they began cutting back, and one of the things they cut back on was mental health facilities. The amount of space available in mental hospitals was reduced to a fraction of what it used to be, and many mentally ill people were simply let out into the streets with no help and nowhere to live. The amount of homelessness on Canada's streets exploded, started. In most cities, it had been uncommon to see homeless people at all, but from that point on, it became a fixture of life in Canada. But the homelessness caused by Canada turning its back on the mentally ill was just one part of the problem. The other part has to do with what happened to housing. For centuries, housing in Canada was affordable. In fact, it was part of what made Canada so attractive to migrants for generation after generation. Canada is an enormous landmass with a small population, and for most of its history, there was never any problem finding space for people to live on. Canada had some of the cheapest land prices of any wealthy country. Canadian cities had very loose rules on where you could build, if they had any rules at all. No matter how many people showed up on Canada's shores, there were always developers willing to build and space to build on. On top of that, for much of the 20th century, governments had a hand in helping make sure everyone had a home. The provinces and the federal government invested billions into social housing for low-income families. They gave generous tax breaks to developers to build apartment buildings and make it economical to build large amounts of rental housing. And Canada's government-run mortgage issuer, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, guaranteed loans to developers, and it even had a catalog of pre-approved home designs that developers could build quickly. In other words, Canada made sure that there was housing available at every income level. But then things began to change. In the 1980s, the Conservative government of Prime Minister Brian Mulroney decided the government shouldn't be involved in housing. Spending on social housing disappeared, as did loan guarantees to developers. Meanwhile, cities were changing. The days of being able to build what you want, where you want, had come to an end. Municipalities brought in zoning rules that restricted what could be built and where. Much of that was driven by NIMBYism, the not in my backyard phenomenon. Homeowners didn't want new developments in their neighborhoods. They wanted the character of the neighborhood they moved into to be preserved. So city councilors made it practically impossible to develop new houses in existing neighborhoods. But Canadians were also growing worried about urban sprawl eating into Canada's beautiful wilderness and paving over its valuable farmland. Canada may be a big country, but it's cold and far to the north. Only a small fraction of Canada's land is usable as farmland, and that's exactly where Canada's cities were built. As cities expanded, they began to occupy large chunks of Canada's best farmland. Experts warned that if this continued, Canada would face serious food insecurity and would have to become entirely dependent on foreign countries to feed its own population. So politicians in various provinces and cities began to work to contain urban sprawl. Today, there is an urban containment boundary around Vancouver which protects the farmland surrounding the city from being converted into housing. The Toronto metro area has a green belt surrounding it which protects the wilderness and farms around the city, but it also severely restricts where housing can be built, and space within the green belt is running out. Meanwhile, Canadian municipal governments began treating housing like a cash cow. Year after year, decade after decade, they raised the development charges on new homes. That is, the taxes they charge to developers for building new homes. In Toronto today, a new single-family home comes with a developer fee of $137,000. There are places in North America where you can buy a whole house for that money, but in Toronto, that's just what they charge in taxes on a new home. The old saying among economists is that if you tax something, you get less of it. As developer fees have gone up, new housing construction has gone down. With no ability to build in existing neighborhoods and with land running out on the edges of cities, real estate developers began to bid up the prices of whatever land was available. By the early 2000s, land prices in Canada were soaring. Canadian land was no longer among the cheapest in the developed world. House prices began to soar, and it looked like Canada was heading for a serious housing affordability problem. But Canada's policymakers found a quote-unquote solution to the problem. They decided to get Canadians deep into debt. In 2008 and 2009, the world fell into a deep financial crisis, but Canada didn't. Even as banks and lenders in the US and Europe collapsed, Canada's financial system kept running smoothly. Despite this, the country's central bank, Bank of Canada, decided to follow other central banks around the world and dropped its key lending rate to near zero. Suddenly, mortgage rates in Canada fell to record lows, and Canadians found themselves with far more buying power when it came to the housing market. The lower your mortgage rate, the less interest has to be included in your monthly payment, which means that the lower your mortgage rate, the higher the price you can afford for the same monthly payment. The home buying power of Canadians soared, and from that point on, house prices began to climb relentlessly. But those rising house prices meant Canadians were getting further and further into debt. Today, Canadian households have the highest debt load among G7 countries and some of the least affordable housing. In a recent global survey, the city of Vancouver was ranked the third least affordable city in the world, while Toronto ranked as the 10th least affordable city worldwide. Relative to people's incomes, these cities are now less affordable than New York or Paris, the dream that brought generations of of immigrants to Canada is dead. And the problem was made worse during the COVID pandemic. As Canada's economy froze up due to lockdowns and business shutdowns, the Bank of Canada once again dropped interest rates to rock bottom levels. But this time it did something else too. It started buying mortgages off of the books of mortgage lenders. It bought those mortgages with freshly printed cash. Armed with this cash, mortgage lenders offered new mortgages at rock bottom rates. In 2020 and 2021, it was possible to get a mortgage in Canada with a rate of less than 1%. All this juiced the housing market to extreme levels. In the space of a few years during the pandemic, many cities in Canada saw house prices grow by 50% or more. But that freshly printed cash in Canada and in many other countries did something else too. It triggered the worst wave of inflation that the world had seen in decades. The standard definition of inflation among economists today is that it's too much money chasing after too few goods. The pandemic lockdowns caused production in the economy to drop. There were fewer goods floating around, but there was far more money to pay for those goods. In those circumstances, inflation is inevitable. And when inflation happens, central banks raise their interest rates to reduce price growth by raising the cost of borrowing. Like central banks around the world, the Bank of Canada began raising interest rates in 2022. This caused mortgage rates to soar, making housing less affordable. It also meant that landlords began raising rents. Due to the housing frenzy of recent years, many Canadians bought second and third homes as an investment, and when interest rates started soaring, they started seeing their monthly mortgage payments soar as well. In most Canadian provinces, there are limits to how much you can raise an existing tenant's rent in any given year. But if a landlord can get a tenant out, they can charge whatever they want to the next tenant. In some places, this might not be technically legal, but it's easy to get away with because a new tenant doesn't know what the previous one paid. And there is one way that a landlord can legally evict the tenants of a building if they plan to renovate the building and put it on the market at higher rental rates. In recent years, Canada has seen a wave of renovictions. Residents of entire apartment buildings have been thrown out into the streets so that landlords could rent the building at higher prices. With rents and renovictions soaring, with mortgage rates hitting new highs month after month, and with the supply of new housing choked off by government regulations and NIMBY neighbors, it's no wonder homelessness is soaring in Canada. The crisis facing Canada today has no easy solution. It took decades of policy failures to get to this point, and the country is decades behind in building an adequate housing supply. It will take decades to get out of this hole. In the meantime, expect things to get worse before they get any better. To learn more about what comes next for Canada's housing market, check out our recent video on Canada's massive housing bubble. And if this video brought value to you, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching.